Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to be investigating the situation which has really been quite prevalent across the news, and it's been sort of spreading across the online world over the course of this week. And this is of course the feud between the famous Nick Fuentes and of Tucker Carlson. So I'm going to first explain what the situation is if you're not already aware, what happened, let's say the mistake and the infighting, etc. Then I'll move on to sort of a rational investigation onto whether Nick Fuentes is colloquially called a Fed, or what this position is, and then eventually what it means for politics as a whole, what this would mean in the broader sense of history, as it's being made right now. I think this is actually quite an important event, and how this positions the right in the future. So let's dive into it. So the situation is that Nick Fuentes, who is a famous American, it's hard to sort of give him a label, because Nick Fuentes is essentially, he's not right-wing, so to like don't get me wrong, he's right-wing, but he's not like what you'd usually think of as a right-winger. He doesn't necessarily have all the traits that you would call a right-winger to have. He is not essentially anti-utopian. He has spoken many times before about if they get rid of undesirables in their society, how they will essentially live in a utopia, which if you're truly, let's say, ideologically on the right wing of politics, you will never believe.
Jews are running society, women need to shut the fuck up, blacks need to be imprisoned for the most part, and we would live in paradise. It's that simple. It's literally that simple.
And I know that's a generalization, and these sort of terms are just labels given to things that change and morph throughout time, but that when people don't fit into these labels, they kind of end up in some sort of gray zone. So it would be unfair to call Nick Fuentes even remotely similar to the vast majority of other, say, conservatives or right-wingers. However, it is important to establish that he has a significant presence and place in the modern right. His followers are famously called Groypers, and he came to his prevalence. He was at Charlottesville in 2017. He went and he was quite significant in the age, like on the run-up to Trump's campaign in 2020. I believe he participated at the Capitol. There's a lot of stuff going on about that as well, especially in regards to other people who weren't there, supposedly told by the FBI not to go, etc. But anyways, we've then got him essentially being interviewed by a woman called Candace Owens, and it's pretty interesting because Candace Owens is an African American. She's black, but she's a black woman, which is very interesting because Nick Fuentes himself is quite, well, he does make his position clear on these people, and to give him credit, he does hold up a good face throughout the course of the interview. He doesn't like, he's polite, okay, let's say that. He doesn't crack down and become some obnoxious sort of, just a guy full of hate, and he tolerates the interview and he goes through it. And I believe, although of course I wasn't there, I don't really know what they think, that it wasn't a bad interview. There wasn't too much, bad stuff coming from it. I think, Candace tried to whip something out onto Nick. It sort of backfired, and this is going to be a common theme with this upcoming bit. But now the main part of this story is later on, so that was like maybe a month ago or so. And then Candace Owens goes on to Tucker Carlson's podcast. So Tucker Carlson is, of course, he was the old head of Fox News. He was extremely famous. He's sort of like a symbol for what I would consider to be the old right in America. So Tucker Carlson stands as a man with the traditional socially conservative, economically right-wing type stuff, okay? Anti-communist, anti-modern day liberal, a semi-type of libertarianism. The typical type of, like, when you think of, say, the Republican Party in the US, or that sort of wing of politics, it's really the old traditional conservative right that was pretty much the predominant one before, I'm going to say, 2021 or 2022. And, of course, Candace Owens, who herself is sort of in between that. She seems to be a member of, well, the neocons, even though Tucker himself went after the neocons. I think it would be pretty funny not that he's doing that, considering I think for the vast majority of his time he could have been definitely considered to be a neocon. But anyways, moving on, they're having this discussion, and, well, listen to this.
You had to take that guy out. And Nick Fuentes, this weird little gay kid in his basement in Chicago, is participating in a super PAC to bump off Joe Kent.
So they're essentially throwing, well, shit at Nick Fuentes. They call Nick, and I quote, this weird little gay kid in his basement in Chicago. And this is really like a have you seen, like in Inglourious Bastard?
3 Gläser.
Because the interesting thing is that recently there's been a very large shift on the part of the old right to try and shift to capture the enormous emerging market of the new right. And whether the old right or Carlson likes it or not, they are the disaffected, usually young white man who probably lives, very much like a loser, who is in his basement, who doesn't have, like, he might have a job, but he's not too high up, okay? He's maybe didn't get into the best universities, or life just hasn't really gone his way. He most certainly won't have a girlfriend, probably. And it really is this disaffected young people who really emerge, who don't really care about the economics of things. Fundamentally, they do not care about the economics of things. But this new right, you better be damn sure they care about the social aspect of things, because it is the social aspect of things which is an enormous part of this new right. And if you look, and I'll make videos about this later, about actually the structure of the new right and the right as a whole. It is important to examine that these are fundamentally very different, because I would argue that the old right, the old conservatives, were mainly based, they had their policies centered on the anti-communist front, so they were far more actually on the economic side. They cared a lot more about maintaining the free market than they did really about social policies. Which, don't get me wrong, they still care about social policies, and members of the old right definitely did their part there. However, it is important to state that there has been an enormous shift of centralization that Carlson and Candace are trying to capture as part of their own movements, as part of, say, Turning Point USA, and to then channel it into their own, exterior motives. So when this moment happens, it really is quite a mistake. It's a big slip up on the part of Carlson, because he is essentially using an insult for Nick. He's calling him someone that actually Carlson is trying to attract as his main member, like, viewer base. That is the face of, believe it or not, the new right these days. It isn't going to be the wealthy, aristocratic base that probably the old right would have been significantly part of, the wealthy university newspaper journalist type people that Carlson himself was part of. It's going to be, yes, probably people like Nick. And so when he insults Nick based on those characteristics, it truly does turn into a mistake, and Nick weaponizes this immensely. He creates a response which, well, listen to it.
But here's the other thing. Tucker Carlson said I'm a weird gay kid in the basement. Yeah, and I'm from Chicago. You're right. Well, okay, you're not right about all of that. But I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Tucker Carlson says, I have so many trust funds, I never have to work. Tucker went to a $45,000 per year private high school, then a $45,000 per year selective Ivy League school in New England. Tucker Carlson's daddy was a Reagan appointee. And then, after years of bragging about being an elite, bragging about being so out of touch and so rich, now he's going to be the spokesperson for all the white people. Now he's going to roll up his sleeves. I just like to hunt and fish in my log cabin. I care about Klarna and credit card debt. But then when it comes to me, I'm one of the real disaffected white people. You want to talk about me and them? I am them. He says Nick Fuentes is leading all of the disaffected young white men. I am a disaffected young white man. I was a precocious, intelligent, young white college student who went to Boston University, who was pro-Trump and red-pilled by Trump and animated by Trump's message of America first. And I asked questions about Israel, and I was punished for it. I did it years before Tucker Carlson started talking about Israel last year. And I sacrificed, and I was targeted by the ADL, by the SPLC, by the federal government, by the conservative movement that both Candace and Tucker were a part of.
But even further from that, there's more to it. Tucker calls Nick, very importantly, a Fed. Now, a Fed is someone who is essentially a plant. He's working for the government, or like a covert government agency, as part of a PSYOP. Usually it would be a gray or black level PSYOP. And they are attempting to essentially sway public opinion through whatever way.
In one of the saddest ironies of all, like, he's acting against your interests, actually. It's,
yeah,
it's really dark.
Yeah, I don't believe he says, I no longer think that he believes what he says.
Now, the argument for Nick being Fed is an interesting one that I'll touch on later in this video. But it's important to establish that Tucker's claim of Nick being a Fed gets enormously weaponized by Nick himself. There is good argument to Nick being a Fed, don't get me wrong, and I will touch on that. Very good argument. But from a person like Tucker Carlson, oh my goodness, was that a big misstep? That's shooting yourself in the fucking foot, man. I know you didn't know that your father was part of the CIA, or so you say, but if you're literally, like, as I believe he goes on to explain, given money, when you were in your journalistic career, when you're starting off as a student newspaper, if you are given money by organizations who are actually also part of PSYOPs to help with neoconservative thinking as you're developing and organized by the CIA as well, how on earth are you in a position to talk about someone else like that, especially someone who is so damaging to your own neoconservative way of thinking and is most likely the biggest threat you will face? And so to the vast majority of viewers, I'm going to say that this was probably an enormous misstep for both Candace and Tucker. Whether or not they realize it or not, because I think now they do, but at the time not, because it was probably some offhand comment that most likely they were already thinking about them anyways. And it really shows that actually they don't really have much. They don't actually really support this new right. They're only doing it because it's gained so much popularity, because it's gained so much traction, not the other way around, not because they were swayed. And really, I think it is going to be very important to the developments of the future. So, interestingly as well, Nick himself has risen to immense fame and popularity over the last couple of weeks. It's been really weird considering that this is his second rise after his, let's say, initial wave during January 6th, and when he got his account all frozen. If you look at videos if you search Nick Fuentes up, most of the things that will appear are either going to be from, let's say, 4 years old or something, or then they're going to be very recent. Interesting, and I'm not entirely sure why this is, why he suddenly has come back resurgence. Probably something to do with Candace. Candy's balls fit in your mouth. But that is a point of debate. Maybe you guys can suggest it in the comments, because I'm not entirely sure. But to now move on to the part about whether he is a Fed. So, Nick initially seems like a really obvious Fed. Now, what I mean by this is that he would have been planted in, let's say, by an organization such as the CIA. Look, there's so many different organizations I'm sure there are out there that really it doesn't matter. And they would have put Nick in as someone with crazy, absurd views to link them together with other parts of the right to essentially discredit them and to not only show supporters of the left what the supposedly true face of the right is, but to also show potentially undecided neocons, something like that, let's say, to warn them of what this new right is like, and to sort of make them scared from ever interfering with it, especially if you're someone like Tucker. Let's say you spent your whole life supporting Israel, and all of a sudden Nick Fuentes comes along and saying that they should have killed all the you-know-whats. That will really prevent you from doing anything with it, and especially when Nick will then say, link that to other things that might be more, let's say, moderate conservative points. Everything he touches becomes deadly. If something that a really extreme person or so touches, if, like, let's say some National Socialists would go into it, then every other sect of, well, conservatism cannot for the life of them touch it. That would be almost political suicide, and they realize that very well, and it's also something that's probably not even that linked to their own ideologies. So it is an interesting point to make on the value of having someone like this, especially if you want a mediating force to prevent the right or the left from going too far to the right or the left. And it's certainly very interesting, but I'm going to make the claim that Nick is not a Fed. So the main argument for Nick being a Fed is practically, number one, his extreme, almost idiotically blatant, like, views. Okay, I'm not saying this to discredit his views. Look, I don't believe in many of his views. I might believe in some. I might believe in others, and I might not believe in many others. But what I'm trying to say here, without trying to be biased or critical of his policies, is that overall most of his views are very radical, and he's being radical in a way that is being, like, stupidly obvious. Okay, I mean, if you're jumping up and down and wagging your hands and saying Hitler,
greatest American general,
Hitler. Oh, American.
$10.
like, come on. Come on. That's like, if you wanted to be more subtle about it, to convey your point, maybe actually try and work out an argument for why this guy is so good. If that's your gist, all right? I'm not saying he is, but that's maybe Nick's point of view. Then make it. But for fuck's sake, don't act like a spastic and stand up there wagging your hands and say, Hitler. It's like, come on. That's not an intellectual way to approach things, and it's certainly not how politics should be constructed. So a lot of his views, I will say are like that, because he's definitely got his moments where he's a lot more moderate and a lot more radical. And I think the thing is that's very important is that someone who is someone who, let's say, is intending to taint those moderate views is someone who will essentially go back and forth, so as to create a sense of uncertainty amongst other people whether or not those views themselves are actually radical or not, and whether or not they should have them or touch them or etc. is very much influenced by if these supposed radicals, who admittedly can look very silly and very childish, are touching this and using these policies as their own. And that is an integral part of a psyop. But I actually don't think he is. And if I had to put money on whether or not Tucker and Candace were on the CIA payroll or APAC payroll versus Nick, I think you'd have my money. I'd put it all in on Tucker. I'd can't. Okay. Although he does many things which make it seem very, let's say, stupidly trying to fondle with moderate policies while also spouting radical ones, which is quite a negative trait for the separation of the two. He fundamentally seems very grassroots. He didn't suddenly appear. Well, I mean, he is now for the second time, but he didn't suddenly just appear out of nowhere. He doesn't have funding. He was in Boston University. He had to use like a friend's dorm room to record these videos, in which he was then persecuted enormously for it.
Say my name. They were afraid to be in pictures with me. I was the boogeyman in conservative politics for literally a decade. This much is not disputed. I am literally banned on everything. I am banned on Airbnb. I am banned on Email Octopus. I am banned from Chase Bank, Bank of America, U.S. Bank, Fifth Third Bank, Inland Bank, PayPal, Stripe, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. Elon won't let me have a check mark on Twitter, even though I'm on there. It's endless.
He's forced to conduct his live streams on literally non-well-known sites whatsoever. I think like Rumble or some shit like that. If you search him up on YouTube, it'll just be a bunch of, like, you know, people reacting to it or etc. And while he does have a lot of clips online about him, to actually find his show is very, very difficult. And they've made it very, very difficult. Now, if you are from the perspective of, say, someone trying to do a psyop like this, would you make it easier or harder to access their content? I mean, you'd want a median. And this is actually another argument for why he potentially could be a Fed, is if you take the view that that feds themselves, like the CIA, okay? If you take the view that the CIA and that there's a huge cabal running the internet, essentially, you could argue that if, let's say, Jews are truly as powerful as Nick says they are, then why is he still on the internet at all, okay? If there are ways to essentially vaporize someone as easily as Nick says they did, then why is he still here and why is he still able to do things? Undoubtedly he's been attacked numerous times. Undoubtedly the people are trying to take him down left, right and center, and he has to constantly switch. But it's an interesting point to see that if the people who he thinks are as powerful as they truly are, whether or not it is Jewish people or whether or not it is just like the globalists or whomever, why is he still able to access his platform? So I think he's sort of in a median position there when it comes to his actual platforms, where you don't actually really know whether or not he's being supported by government, because while he is restricted on a bunch of things, the fact that he's not gone in like he's not just disappeared if you know what I mean. Like, someone did try and kill him, and that's interesting. That's really interesting, because it means that his views definitely have penetrated somewhere, but I highly doubt that was like a properly organized thing, because I mark my words, man, if Mossad wanted him dead, he'd be dead. So that probably would have been a psyop on its own to try and deal with Nick. And if the attempt to kill Nick was in itself a psyop, it just proves up the point further that Nick himself is not a psyop, if that makes any sense to you guys. All right, there's no point in trying to persuade a bunch of people to hate Nick to the extent that they want to kill him, to then hunt after one of your prized psyop possessions. I mean, look, if you lose him, he essentially becomes a martyr for that that kind of the right, and that's definitely not what you want. You want him alive, you want him continuing his show, and optimally you want him discrediting a bunch of other positions. Like, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that some of Nick's more radical ideas and policies, like he believes that, like, women shouldn't have any position in society, or, well, no, not like that, not any position, but he believes that they should have a far lesser position. Well, I mean, obviously that as well, if you think rationally about it, that is also nuanced. Look, something I like to say a lot is everything is nuanced, and there's no one right and one wrong. There's no women are not fully fully emancipated and they're not fully enslaved. That's not how things work. And emancipation is not always equal to happiness and freedom. Like, if you are having the same rights as a man doesn't necessarily translate to your own happiness or your own freedom in a truer sense. But anyways, it is clear that he's trying to isolate at least women from this new right as much as possible. And I mean, to some extent, this is a point of attraction for the incel right, which I think a lot of people underestimate in its size. And I'll discuss about this in a future video, but they are probably a really important ally for Nick to have. And they might even be worth losing women in the short term for. But in the long term, it is of absolutely no position for you to be outright advocating for something that is in such against women's own self-interest, okay? Because there's many better ways to spin it, Nick. Look, you're not going to watch this video, but there are so many better ways to spin it if you wanted to. I personally would not think that that's the optimal thing to do. And restricting completely one's rights and freedoms that they have newly gained for absolutely no reason other than the idea that they are stupid is not the best way to go. You can argue that you want them to take a more traditional role. That much is fair, and you can make a good point for that. But it is stupid to argue the point that you should just strip them away of, let's say, one part of their life that they have gained, whether they like it or not, for no reason, without giving them any concessions in the other. And probably, like, if you just tell them, like, I want women to shut the fuck up, like, if that's one of his lines, that's something that he says, okay? And that is like, it's very psyopy in itself. Like no serious political figure can possibly try and take a point for that if they were ever trying to start a meaningful political movement. If Nick wanted his Groypers to actually do something significant and actually have the possibility of becoming a significant political movement, not only across his country, but across the world, he would not isolate 50% of people. He'd find a way to include them in some manner, okay? And this brings me to a larger point about Nick potentially being a Fed as well. I know I've put forward a lot of arguments for him potentially being a Fed, but look, you guys make your own minds up. It's that he's not actually really establishing the grounds for any movement. He's got an enormous platform. He's got so many people who are watching his videos. He's immensely inflammatory. He's got a lot of followers. Groypers are huge and they're immensely powerful. But he doesn't do anything with it. If he wanted, he could become a huge political force within America today. But he's not. And you're thinking, if you're a government who's trying to, let's say, use someone as like a psyop to maintain their own power, you do not want him to create a political movement. You want him to keep him as just a guy who does podcasts that is slowly but surely creating feuds and discrediting within the right. Okay, so you guys make your own mind up on whether or not he's a Fed or not, but I think just my hunch is he's not. That's my hunch, but you guys make your own rational decision making about that. That's kind of what this channel's about. So now moving on to the next bit. How will the infighting as a whole be damaging to the right? And what does it do? So I believe that this will place the right in a perpetual position of being anti-establishment and reactionary, or at least it risks it. So the issue that we might have here is that Nick himself, if he gains significant traction to become an enormous political force, Nick is an enormously anti-establishment person. And it is clear that his views are such that even though he supported Trump in 2016 and he supported him again, he was let down. And look, Trump's presidency has been a letdown for many people on the right. But it is clear that if some parts of the new right maintain a constant anti-establishment narrative, no matter who's in power, no matter if it's a conservative or no matter if it's a liberal in power, you're going to get to this point where the right feuds over itself and where there's infighting. And infighting, I'm trying to look at this from a non-biased third-party position, infighting within the right will undeniably be damaging to it. It is the thing that kills the left. Infighting kills the left. I will say it, and it's been proven in history time and time again. Infighting kills the left, and the right only usually wins because it stays unified, and the right's usually about unity. If it starts collapsing, and through infighting about pretty much absurdist issues, like you can disagree about the extent to which, let's say, Israel or AIPAC's influence is there in the United States, but if you get to the point where Groypers are, say, talking about conducting a second genocide, which I'm not saying they will, but then comparing that to the old neocon perspective of give more stuff to Israel, you can clearly see that those are two things that completely disalign with one another, and they might even have the old leftist paradigm of one faction aligns itself with the other side of politics because how much they hate their own side of politics. If this happens again, like let's say Tucker starts to say, well, actually, you know what? what? I think I have to agree on the US is a bad example because it's a binary political system, but I actually have to agree on Israel policy with the Democrats. You know, it's going to really fracture it, and it prevents it from being one unified entity, which is an interesting part of American politics in itself, because European politics does not have this problem. It really doesn't, and it's why I think in many parts the right in Europe is so much more united, because they're all united against pretty much with their strongest issues, which is immigration. This has essentially created an enormous gap for the right to come in, where this hasn't happened in the US, okay? Where this can't happen in the US because of sticklers like things like Israel and policy towards Israel, where the conservatives that have been in power and have been doing these policies are quite literally paid by Israel, which creates enormous division. So to just examine it in total, I think that the manifestation of the old Tucker versus Nick is a very good example of an old right versus new right, and it's a continuation of the Groyper War. And in the long term, I think that the right should examine ways to stay unified and to find a way to agree on this issue rather than disagree. And even if they disagree slightly on like specific Israel policy, they mustn't get caught up with themselves like the left does, because that will fundamentally be the downfall, preventing them from ascendancy. Okay, so these are just my thoughts about this whole Nick debate, especially on the Fed stuff and what the different arguments might be there. So well, tell me in the comments if you disagree or not, and thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.